Hi, welcome to today's HR Forum, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, What's Working and What's Not. I'm Elaine Varelis, Managing Partner for Keystone Partners. We are excited to have you all here today. The goal of our HR Forum program is to bring together HR professionals from across the region to discuss issues, challenges, and trends in the industry. Today we have a wide range of participants across the spectrum of HR roles, including many of you with diversity in your titles. Some of the industries represented include education and higher ed, not-for-profit, healthcare, manufacturing, finance, legal, technology, electronics, biotech, pharma, very, very broad spectrum. I'm delighted to introduce you today's moderator, Tracy Salters from our Dallas office. Tracy has extensive experience in team and organizational development, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and succession management. I hand you over to Tracy to introduce our amazing panelists today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Elaine. And I am so excited to be with you this afternoon. And I have the esteemed honor of moderating this auspicious panel. I'm thrilled, and I'm going to do my best to stay out of the way so that you can glean insights from them. I want to do a couple of housekeeping things just quickly so that we can move swiftly through the program. Just as an FYI, and this was included in some of the information that you received, the webinar is being recorded and it will be sent to you in a follow-up email to all of those who've registered. That follow-up email will also include any additional resources that we cite or note during the course of the discussion and things that we think that you might find particularly informative and interesting. You should have also received an email this morning, not only reminding you about this event, but also providing you with some content, some helpful language, some lexicon, some definitions that are relevant to the discussion that we'll be having. And if you'd like to have that up on your screen for reference, because while we'll try to move quickly, we don't want to lose anyone in any of the language. So certainly, if you go back to that email just for reference, I think that you'll find that helpful. The chat is disabled for the attendees, but there is space for you to add any questions to the Q&A that should show up at the bottom of your screen. And the reason for that is this: we received a huge amount of questions, and we were very excited and encouraged by that. The questions are very thought-provoking, they're very process-oriented, and they're based in a variety of different things that fall into the DEIB space. And we're going to try to answer as many as we can, but to do so, what we've done is try to group and categorize some of them, and we'll try to take those, in order, spend as much time as we can, and cover as much ground as we can. But some of it will be relatively broad. We're going to try not to get stuck in any of the corners, and we're not legal experts. I need to make that disclaimer. We're not legal experts, so please keep in mind that we'll focus on HR and business practices, try to provide some information of interest, and ensure that we can address some of the things that you asked. To level set before we get started, I'd like to introduce a poll and then introduce our panelists. I want to introduce the poll so that we can get a pulse check and a little bit of grounding and foundation on where today's attendees are and where to level set our discussion and some of the answers to your questions. So here's the poll. We want to get a sense of your level of DEIB experience. There's 3 choices there. So if you would, quickly, if you would respond and submit, and we'll look at those results and then move to our panel. We've got a an outstanding award-winning production team behind the scenes that's managing our poll. If you give me a heads up on where you are, I have a little bit of a countdown clock going on here, but I want to make sure. So tell you what, I'll give you about 10 more seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6. Hopefully this is as irritating as I'll be during this session. 5, 4, 3.
You're not irritating.
2, 1. Okay, let's look at the poll. Wow. Okay, that's great. So while we have, a few outliers, the bulk of this group, 84%, has started the journey in the DEIB space. That is phenomenal. So that means that there's a lot of insightful players that are a part of this session, a lot of individuals who are already moving. So as we move along, certainly if there's additional information that you can add, best practices, additional ideas, we're welcome to that. If you capture those in your Q&A responses, we'll be careful to capture that information as well. So again, I'm Tracy Salters. I'm with Keystone Partners based in the Dallas office, but I'm not really the focus of our forum today. We have two great panelists who are with us. I will say we had a third panelist that was scheduled to be with us, Charu Manoka, who was unable to join us at this time due to a work emergency, but don't be in any way dismayed because we have great panelists. And I'd like to have them introduce themselves to you, tell you a little bit about their background, their focus in this space, and then we'll get to your questions. So Anuradha, would you start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So delighted to be here with you, Tracy, and everybody else today on the call. Looking forward to this really great discussion. I'm Anuradha Hebbar. I run the global practice for diversity, equity, and inclusion for Kincentric, which is a Spencer Stewart company. We do consulting to unlock the power of people and teams. What that means is we do a lot of engagement work, culture and engagement work, actually, leadership assessment and development, DEI. We use all of these levers to really transform organizations and drive change. I have been a leader in the DEI space internally as well at Verizon, Blue Cross Blue Shield, as well as Zurich and McDonald's. Have spent the bulk of my career as an attorney, then really in marketing, and then consulting. And so I bring a really broad background to this work and embedding it into kind of cultures and organizations to drive change. So delighted to be with you all.
Great, Anuradha. Thank you so much. Kristina.
Thank you, Tracy. Equally delighted to be here with everybody today. Thank you for having me. So Christina Brunelle, I am the Global Head of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Research Triangle Institute International, RTI, located in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. We have offices, 73 offices around the globe, and our mission is to improve the human condition by turning knowledge into practice. And so what that translates into is I am surrounded by brilliant scientists and researchers who are pursuing their passions in the sciences of their choice. And we are basically helping to solve the world's ills along the lines of AIDS and opioid epidemics and reading deficiencies in multiple countries, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been doing this work in the DEIB space, although we didn't always call it that. We called it diversity inclusion for about 10 years now. And of course, over the past year, it has gained significant importance in the eyes of the world and also too within our organization. So I'm very, very pleased that I get to be able to do this work and somebody pays me for it.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for those intros and for giving us a sense of the breadth of your background and experience. I want to have us dive quickly and deeply into really the deep end of the pool and start off, but I'll start us off with some of the questions that we received in advance. And as I said before, we've tried to group some of these things. So let's start first with just, the ideas around DEIB awareness and process within organizations. One of the first questions that we received was, someone wrote in, "This is the first that I'm hearing or seeing about DEIB. My question is, would we benefit from talking about this important business initiative in a more consistent way?" What do you say? What do you think?
I do think that those words mean different things to different people. And I think diversity has been the anchor for a lot of people, depending on the generation that they grew up with, and the others followed, right? And so it was diversity and inclusion for a very long time. Like Kristina said, equity has actually been there for a very long time, but has now been back at the forefront. Equity is actually not a new concept at all. It's probably the oldest of them all. And then belonging, certainly new. And I think that the challenge in organizations is that we don't understand these concepts. We don't have a common language and shared understanding. And there are a lot of voices and definitions around these words. And so I think the job is to align ourselves in organizations and define them as to what it actually means for us in this organization that we're working in. Because that's really where I think we have not gotten past some of the noise and the baggage and things that are happening externally, right? The context that you're living in, there's so many things that have shaped your understanding around these words. And so how do we define it so that everyone owns it, acts upon it, and leads it? And so I think we would benefit if we could do that, and really tying it to our overall people strategy and our business strategy.
Kristina, let me refocus that a little bit and get a little deeper into this. I mean, because it seems like, as Anuradha mentioned, this is a conversation that's been going on for a while. So the concept itself is not new. However, what is it that you would see that is being done or should be done differently to promote and advance the conversation?
That's a great question. So it's interesting. We struggled with this, or struggle is probably a strong word. We had multiple discussions on what do we call this? Because for the longest time we were a D&I. And we felt it was important to bring equity back to the forefront, because to Anuradha's point, that really is what we're talking about. Diversity is, yes, we want to have a diverse group of employees. Inclusion is, do they feel included and valued once they're here? Because you could have a very diverse set of employees, but that doesn't mean they like working for you or that they feel like they can do their best work. And that was largely why we added the belonging, because we wanted people to feel like, not only am I valued and respected for the qualities that I bring to the table, regardless of what I look like, but I also feel comfortable here so that I can do my best work. And there is a distinct difference between going someplace every single day, Monday through Friday, or even Zooming in, where you're just sort of paying your dues, versus someplace you really like to go and you really enjoy being there because you feel like that's exactly where you belong. And so we are still on an educational path of making sure people understand what all those different terms mean. But the challenge, or to your question, I think the challenge that a lot of organizations face is recognizing that differential of, yeah, just bringing people who are different from us in the door is not enough. It's not going to do enough, because there's magnificence within each one of those individuals. And if we don't tap into it by providing that safe space, by providing an environment where they feel comfortable with their manager, they feel comfortable with their peers, they feel comfortable talking to leadership, then we're not reaping the benefit of bringing that diversity in the door. And so that's the sort of transition that people haven't necessarily connected with yet, I think, that we need to.
Kristina, pick up from there, and let's stay with that thought for a second. Speak to me a little bit about how you see that impacting the recruiting of diverse candidates. So,
lots of thoughts. We could talk about this one for a long time. I once was chatting with someone at a conference who they said, well, we've tried, like we're recruiting at all the HBCUs, the historically Black colleges and universities, and we're just not getting what we need. And I said, well, have you tried beyond the HBCUs? There are other organizations and social and professional associations that you could attempt to connect with. Oh, right. So that's the baby step person who needs, they have a long way to go, per se. But there are so many different organizations that a recruiting team can connect with. There are so many different places to post job descriptions. And I all too often I hear people saying, oh, but I just can't find the talent. I just can't find the talent. Well, are you really looking? And when you are looking, are you looking with a lens of like, I'll take anybody, or are you holding to the same standards of excellence that you would expect of anybody else, and finding talent that satisfies that level that you're looking for? Because it's out there. You can't tell me that all the excellent Black people and all the excellent Hispanic people and all the excellent Asian people are hiding under a rock. They are not. They're not going, oh, I don't want that job. I don't want that job. I don't want that job. That's not what's happening. It's that we are not really, really making an effort to look in the right places and to be explicit about it. The other challenge we have is all too often, I think a lot of organizations, they get one diverse candidate on the slate of who they're thinking about and who they're interviewing. And they think, oh, okay, well, we've done our job. Now hiring manager, pick from all these people. Well, studies show that if you only have one diverse candidate on that slate, that in the mind of the interviewers, they other that one individual. They say, oh, one of these things is not like the other, so I can just discount it. And so in order for somebody who's considered diverse to come all the way through the pipeline and reach an actual opportunity to be hired, you have to have more than one. And so people forget that or don't know that. And so that's a key element to making this happen and making it real.
No, I appreciate that. Anuradha, I saw just lots of nods and smiles. What would you say to that? What's the challenge? What ideas would you offer for, recruiting or enhancing the recruitment of diverse candidates?
Yeah, I mean, I think today the workforce is diverse. It's highly diverse, right? So in the United States, it's 66% women and people of color. Obviously, you throw on other dimensions of diversity that are immutable, LGBT, et cetera, veterans, millennials, generational differences, right? 44%. We have a highly diverse workforce in the United States and certainly globally, right? So if you're not getting your fair share of talent today in a mix that's highly diverse, that's a systemic problem. And so from my perspective, we've been talking about this as the problem for a long time. It's actually not. And so because the pools of talent actually exist in most fields, especially at the entry level. And so what we have to do is systemically, from sourcing all the way to selection, really attack that process and make sure we debias it, as well as train hiring managers on the importance of this. I think those two things don't necessarily always come together. But we've got to start thinking about this a little bit differently. But I think the fact that those pools of talent don't exist today is somewhat of an excuse, right?
Yeah, and to Anuradha's point about debiasing. So I run into multiple organizations, and I've worked for multiple organizations where interviewing candidates is oh, well, can we just have a conversation and does it feel good and do I like this person? Well, that's right bias. Versus having a structured interview process where each candidate is asked the same exact questions. They are interviewed by the same slate of interviewers, and they are evaluated against objective competencies that everybody has agreed upon beforehand. That's a whole different level. And a lot of organizations, A, don't realize that that's how they should or could be doing it. Or B, they say, well, that's a lot of work. I don't know if I want to go through that for that.
Yeah.
And well, then you're going to get the same results that you've always gotten. You're going to have people hiring people that look like them and sound like them and feel like them and went to the same schools that they did. And you're not going to get the diversity that you need.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting because each of you mentioned some of those institutional and process related biases that impact, both the recruitment as well as the retention, of diverse candidates. So Anuradha, if you would, tell me a little bit just from your past experience, what have you seen that really works? And if you think back to when you started on your journey in this space, what's something that jumps out as, hey, this really worked well, or hey, here's something that I learned doesn't work so well?
Yeah, I'm an old hat too in this crowd, so it's I'm one of the smaller groups of people in that old hat category. But we've been watching this for a long time, right? And have been trying to change organizations from the inside around this, and progress has stalled. Right? We spent billions and billions of dollars around this for 2 decades, and we haven't driven outcomes. And so I think where we are today is that the workforce is highly diverse, whatever context you're living in, and organizations at the bottom are, but they're homogeneous at the top, right? So CEOs today are 92% white. That is really different from where it was, actually. It's declining. And so that to me is the problem we're trying to solve. And I think we've got to do things differently. I think the playbook has to shift because what we've done in the past hasn't necessarily worked. I don't think there's a silver bullet. I don't think there's just one thing that you can actually do to drive change. I do think you need an integrated strategy that aligns to, your business strategy and your people strategy. And you need change management as part of that. I mean, so few companies actually have a strategic plan that they're sharing with the board and with their executive teams and socializing throughout the organization around what this actually is. I think it shows up as I need more of X, Y, and Z. That's really not a strategic plan. And those aren't really, what are the right initiatives, right, that are going to help us get to what we want. So we need goals, we need outcomes, we need measures. We need to understand what are the 3 things that this organization is going to do based on their data and insights from that data as to what's actually going on internally, not externally. How's this showing up internally for us? And I think that for me is what actually does work, right? Because we then have a clear understanding of what that vision is, what we're trying to achieve, goals around it, we're measuring it, we're diligent like any other business initiative around it. We may not achieve it, but at least we've got clarity and a plan to be able to get there. So I think as part of that, we've got a system, it's leadership and leadership behaviors and culture. But in the middle is this whole conversation around talent and a system around talent that we've got to be able, it's not working for everybody, and an experience for employees that I think isn't necessarily optimal for everybody. And that's where I think we need data and insights I'm a lawyer, so you know that I love data and insights and evidence, but at scale, right? To be able to say, this is what's actually happening in the organization. And this is what we're going to actually go after and solve. I think that's how we make progress. And I've seen some organizations do that and it's worked.
Yeah,
Great.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly, especially the 2 pieces I would double click into that Anuradha shared with us around this being a change management effort. That if people think that equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging work is an initiative or a standalone something over there, then it's not likely to have a tremendous amount of success. It has to be integrated, as Anuradha was talking about, with the organization's goals, their strategic plans, and you need a change management lens on it, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to change a culture that's embedded in people's DNA for historical, hundreds of years. We've been taught that the world is one way and should stay one way, and we're breaking that. It's a cultural change. The other piece around the data. So we recently, we've always published our data internally to our staff, and now we're talking much more about like, okay, we really need to be publishing externally, but we only published it once a year. Once a year, we'd run a report on the demographics, and you could go find it and dig it up, and it was buried deep within our intranet somewhere. Now it's updated every month, and you can see every month, are we making progress or not? And we're measuring both levels, how diverse are our levels of leadership, as well as who's being identified for key talent opportunities, as well as what are our promotion rates within our employees of color populations. And people are looking and they're reading, and now they're starting to like question and ask, which is a great thing. We recently, on top of that, we recently released a racial equity survey across all of our domestic US-based employees. And in the past, whenever we did employee engagement surveys, the survey team would, comb through all the data, and they'd come up with their observations and recommendations, and here's a summary of it, and here's what we think you all should do about it. And then people would generate action plans and go forth and prosper. For the first time ever, rather than doing all of that work, we said, okay, here are the results. RTI, what do you think? What do you think we need to do? Where are the spaces where we have opportunities? Where are the strengths? And what do you think we should do next? And that's never been done before. But that's part of change management, and putting that data in the hands of the people that are actually going to make the difference. Like Anuradha said, until every individual is doing this, it's not this separate initiative, it's not going to be successful.
Well, it sounds like you had the courage also to get at the real data, Kristina, because I think people do engagement survey data typically, and it doesn't really give you a real lens into what's happening, right? And then you've got the chief diversity officer that then goes and does all these listening sessions. And there's this big gap, right? I'm hearing all these things in all these listening sessions, and my engagement data is telling me that everything's great. How do I understand and marry those two? How do I really get to root cause as to what is happening in the organization, in the culture, in the experience we're not asking the right questions in those surveys. And so you need to drill down and do something else, to your point, around DEI to get us those insights, I think. So kudos to you and your team for having the courage to do that, Kristina.
So let's stay there for a second. I mean, think about this, because each of you has mentioned things around change management, impacting the culture of the organization to drive the process. But let's start from a very base issue of affinity bias. And each of you has mentioned this. What tips do you have about how to address that implicit bias that causes people to gravitate toward people who are more like them?
Anuradha, you want to go? You want me to go?
Oh, you can start.
Sure. So personally, I'm going to use an example of my children. So I have two children. One's a 16-year-old son and a 9-year-old, soon to be 10, although she thinks she's 19, daughter. And one of the things that my husband and I were very explicit about before either one of them was born was we wanted to expose them to all kinds of experiences where things were different than what they might perhaps be surrounded by all the time. And what did that look like? That looked like foods from all different countries. That looked like bringing them with us when we traveled for when we had budget to do that. Exposing them to different kinds of music, exposing them to different kinds of books, different, we watch everything from Bollywood to Canal 6 to like all different kinds of exposures, so that when they go out into the real world and experience things that are quote unquote different from them, it's not that different, right? It's somewhat familiar because they've been exposed. And affinity bias really is about, if we go back to cave person times, it has to do with, is this dangerous or is this safe, right? Am I okay to interact with this person, this situation, this room, this building, or is it dangerous and I should get out of here, or I should fight, right? Flee, fight or flight. And in organizations, what we have found at RTI, that the easiest way to sort of negate or diffuse that instinct is through storytelling and through rational, humane, relational conversations, one conversation at a time, where people are getting to know somebody who's different from them in a very humane way. And one of the things that we have put into place is we regularly conduct what we call human libraries. And if nobody's ever heard of it, you can Google it. Don't Google it now because you get distracted. But there's an organization called, I think it's called the Human Library Organization. And it's where, imagine if you were in the world of Zoom, each of us is a quote unquote book, and we tell the story about who we are and why our demographic, whatever it may be, affects us and affects our lives. And people come and they listen, and then they're able to ask questions of the book after they have told their story. And then they'll rotate to take out the next human book, if you will. And so you do about 2 to 3 books in an hour's worth over lunch, per se. And that has been one of the single most activities that we've engaged in that people talk about time and time and time again. Like, I had no idea, because it was so outside the realm of their experience until they heard it from one of their colleagues that they respected.
Great.
Yeah, maybe to add on to that, I think those are all wonderful initiatives, and certainly affinity bias is pervasive, right? That's the problem at the top, right? And we see it show up in succession planning. We see it show up as we think about and talk about the leadership pipeline. We see it in calibration sessions. And so I think you have to start with the process, in addition to obviously helping individuals understand unconscious bias and the mental models we all have. The 3 of us are biased, right? And so we understand in the first 8 seconds, we're looking at color of skin, gender, age, and appearance. That's happening. You don't even know it's happening, and it's happening, right? And so you've got to create an awareness of these concepts, and education can be helpful for that. But then you have to go one step further, right? And create a process that incorporates that into the actual process, and interventions that are point in time that actually help you understand how it shows up. Toolkits to help you have that dialogue. I mean, you've got to debias that process and help leaders understand, how do I check myself, right? You and I were talking about your daughter and being a smithy, right? That's my bias. Like, every time I see a smithy, she's fantastic. I need to meet her. I need to talk to her. Like, it's affinity bias at its best, right? I need to meet your daughter. I said that to you this morning, right? Because that's how it works. But knowing that I'm aware of it, I don't think all smithies are really the best. Well, they are, but I can check myself around that, right? And I'm not just hiring all smithies, right? That's the point. And how do we start to understand that as leaders, how it shows up in the process? The research actually shows, before I go into a talent calibration session, if I watch a point in time 3-minute video around how that shows up in the process, I change the conversation and the decision around talent. So that's what we need to do. And we need to start where really the rubber's hitting the road, right? Performance management, calibration, succession, in my opinion.
And constant reminders.
Yeah.
Doing it right before, making sure that our hiring managers are very aware, and not that they are aware because we gave them a training once 3 years ago where we talked about it, but aware because we were constantly talking about it. And if you want to interview somebody, if you want to hire somebody, if you want to open a requisition, you have to get a refresh on it.
Right. So let me shift dial this in just a little more, because obviously over the course of the past 14, 20 months, we've had a huge reawakening, if you will, around the globe, with the pandemic, with Black Lives Matter, with API, with all of the challenges. Yet, with some of the statements that reflect process and institutions within organizations, we don't always see CEOs participating in word and deed and really reflecting actions that show that level of awareness. So what levers do you see that are most likely to drive that sort of systemic and process change? Kristina, you're nodding, so we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I can't speak for everybody, but I can tell you what we did at RTI. So like I said, we've been working on this for over 10 years. And it didn't have the same level of importance that it has now. Let's just be honest about that. It was there, and it was a consideration, but it wasn't the spotlight that it has of late. And what happened after George Floyd's murder was our Black Employee Resource Group members asked to meet, or their steering committee asked to meet with our executive leadership team. And they had some very frank conversations that resulted in our leadership team, making the statement, putting out the commitments of what we were going to do about it. But it didn't stop there. So for a while, they were meeting with them every single week. And then eventually things sort of calmed down a little bit and it became every month. We still are meeting with them every month. And not only are we meeting with them every month on that topic, but now it caused them to be aware of the other, we have 10 different ERGs and then 3 additional international chapters that they're also meeting with every other month. They get a report from 2 of those. So they're gaining more insight into what's going on at the Institute and what people are thinking and feeling and how that's affecting them. As part of their commitments that they made to the Institute and to our staff, as well as to the public, one of those was self-education. And so they now have gone through white ally training themselves. That was sponsored by our Black Employee Resource Group, and learned about the history of where racism comes from and its birth and subsequent development across our country and the world. And then they wanted more. They said, you know, this is deep stuff, and we like these conversations, and we want to have more of these conversations. And so then we took them through a 21-day equity challenge. So they spent more of their personal time. And both of those yielded action plans where they now are committed to doing things not only within their units and across the Institute, but also in their personal lives. Like they're joining White Men Against Racism in their county seat and serving on committees external to RTI. So a lot of it to me is just about education. And can you open somebody's eyes to see things that they just might not have been aware of at all? And our leaders will be the first to tell you, I'm ashamed that I didn't know a lot of this. I'm ashamed that I didn't research this, that I didn't see this. And I'm so grateful that work brought this to me.
Yeah, what I might add, Tracy, is that, we've been talking a little bit about culture change. And, I work at, with a lot of CEOs and their teams around DEI. And, it's been given a lot of lip service. It's been a great buzzword, right, for a long time. And it hasn't had, to your point, the words and actions behind it. And people have lost credibility now, right? Because it's like boy crying wolf, right? We've been talking about this thing for a long time without the necessary organizational actions and interventions. And I think employees are really dissatisfied right now. And I think the younger generation, they're not silent. I mean, feedback is coming through Slack channels, it's coming through town halls, it's coming through surveys. I mean, we see polarization now in organizations like we do in society. So if you're a CEO today, I mean, this is keeping you up at night, and it should be, because it's a huge issue inside your organization at this point. And I think that's where you have to have, so we talked a little bit about the individual, team, and organizational level. You've got to address inclusion at all 3 levels. But at the organizational level, you have to really understand what's going on, right? How is racism showing up inside? Are African Americans getting promoted at the same rate as everybody else? Are they engaged at the same, levels as everybody else? Like, what is our data telling us? What is the experience of people, right? Because inclusion and exclusion are happening every day for everybody. White men, Asian women, everybody, right, is experiencing these moments. But those exclusionary moments, and they're happening for people that are different from the majority, that takes a huge toll and an emotional tax that actually causes people to feel less confident, to stop performing, and they ultimately leave. We have a major retention problem, right? Diversity hasn't stuck in the 20 years that we've done it. And we're spending billions and billions of dollars a year losing women and people of color. I mean, the tech industry it's spending $16 billion a year in turnover, right? And so that, to me, is we don't have a playbook today. We need to shift it. It starts with self-awareness and leadership at the top. CEOs and their teams lead this. This is not an HR initiative. HR enables it and supports it, but this is a business imperative. They own it. And I believe it starts with their own self-awareness as a team and understanding their blind spots and the decisions that they're making. And we start there, to be honest. And then when you get that and you get the data, then you can really start to move forward about what does this mean and what are we going to do about it? Because I think intentions are good, but we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, there's a question that came up that was offered, and I'm going to try to capture it in the way that it was offered. But I think it's one that certainly deserves some conversation. And it was stated as this: you know, with the emergence of critical race theory in popular culture, you know, how does an organization respectfully acknowledge team members who ascribe to this point of view, as well as acknowledge the business need that all members, you know, deserve respect regardless of race, color, and their feelings and lived experience, but may not feel that there's enough evidence to determine claims of legal or illegal, you know, harassment, bullying, discrimination. How would you address that? How have you addressed that?
Anuradha, you wanna
Kristina.
go? I feel like I always go first. I want Anuradha to have it.
Okay,
I
all
can
right.
go
So
first.
we'll switch. We'll give you. We won't have you go first. So Anuradha, you know, and, you know,
Yeah.
because I'm sure you'll have both, you know, a practical perspective to this as well as a legal perspective to this.
Yeah, well, you know, I want action, right? We got to start to move and drive change. And I think with that question, I'd certainly want the opportunity to clarify it, because I think there are a number of concepts there that seem to not be understood. So there's an affirmative action, compliance, discrimination, there's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are many different concepts, right? And so I'm not sure I really fully understand that question. But the point is, this is the environment and the questions that are on people's minds, right? How do we start to get from awareness to action through understanding? And Kristina has talked a lot about education around what this is. This is an affirmative action, right? Despite the fact that that's etched in people's minds, you know, and that's a remedial legislative, obviously, it's not what diversity, equity, and inclusion is about at all, right? And understanding those concepts is really important. I mean, obviously we want to change mindsets, but who would argue with the fact that everybody in the organization should be valued, respected for who they are, be able to have a voice, to be heard and contribute their best? That's what this conversation is about. What are the barriers or differences that matter? There's lots of them, right? And we need to understand how that's showing up in organizations. And we've got to stop the check the box kind of activity, right? This is strategic, it's systemic, it's culture change. It's about driving innovation. It's about driving business outcomes, right? When you've got diversity and inclusion and everyone in the organization feels like they're valued and they belong. And our engagement survey shows that's really not the case today, right? Most 70% of people in organizations aren't even engaged. I mean, that really is, we've got some major human capital issues, but we've got to get on board with understanding these concepts. And to Kristina's point, if you don't understand them, start to figure out and read about them, ask somebody about them, go to your chief diversity officer, their team, start to lean into that discomfort, because it really does start with your understanding at an individual level. We all are responsible as an individual with our teams to create that environment where everyone feels valued. And so if you don't get it, it's not an excuse anymore. What are you going to do to help understand it? You know, and it's a learning journey, in my opinion.
Agreed.
Kristina?
Yeah. Yeah, it really is largely about education. So I travel in circles that are filled with HR individuals, not just at RTI. And it's not an uncommon theme that I've heard across the circles. And what it speaks to me is a lack of true understanding about the historical context of racism in this country, where it stems from, and how the United States government has legalized certain things that have forced portions of our populations to not be able to accumulate wealth, to be, there's so many not positive words, to suffer when it comes to our educational system and not be valued and treated equally, to have significant amounts of bias against them when it comes to our criminal justice system, to not have the same health opportunities when it comes to walking into a hospital and being asked to be taken care of by a doctor. Like, these are not in people's imaginations. These are laws that have been put on the books And their purpose was deliberate. It was to hold down one portion of the population. It was not, we're not kind and gentle and thoughtful decisions, if you will. And people who don't always understand that. They don't have that historical context because, let's face it, our schools don't teach it. Our movies don't demonstrate it. Our commercials and our print media, they don't talk about this until recently, right? It's always sort of a coded, like, shh, don't talk about that. It's not polite. But I would be interested to hear how many of the 64 participants we have today were taught as children that it's fine and dandy to discuss race at work, at school, in polite conversations, right? No, we've been discouraged from that. And until we can have those conversations, until we do understand what the legal elements have been that have consistently been against people of color in this country, we can't have an educated conversation. And so I would echo Anuradha's point, like, and we don't have any excuses today because there's Google. You can find out, and you can find all kinds of sources to help you figure this out. I would encourage everybody not to go turning to the one or two or few Black people or people of color that you know and start asking them all these questions, because that's putting an unfair burden on your colleagues and family members of color. Go figure it out on your own. They shouldn't have to answer that call.
Yeah, and I think the one other thing I'd add on to that, Kristina, I think that's very insightful, is that the way it shows up in organizations is not necessarily, the bad stuff's going to come out in EEO reports, right? In your litigation, all of that. We're going to catch that through good HR, right? And we do respectful workplace training. We do a lot of stuff. We've got codes of conduct, right? We're making sure that organizations are doing the right thing. I think this stuff that shows up in organizations is way more subtle, right? And that's why the microinequities that happen on a day-to-day basis and the experience is really what's important to understand. It's hard to understand that unless you really got the experience or the exposure of what that actually looks like, right? Because it typically looks like I'm overlooked. I don't feel like I have the opportunity to advance. I don't see people like me. I don't think I can be successful. I just made that statement. Someone else took the credit for it. I mean, there's all these things that show up in an experience and ultimately where people feel devalued, right? They're not heard. They can't speak up. You know, they're overlooked. And so they're not getting the opportunity. That's harder to understand. And how do you actually get that at scale is through insights of what's happening in your talent pipeline and the experience. And that helps you really pinpoint what's going on to be able to solve it. So I think it's just much more subtle. It's these microinequities and microaggressions that show up in organizations that I think we have not fully addressed in organizations. And that goes to culture as well, right?
Anuradha and Kristina, stay with that for a second. You know, those micro inequities and microaggressions, if you will, that occur within organizations. You know, what are your thoughts, best practices, tips on how to surface those, enhance awareness of them, and take action on them? Anuradha, you want to start with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if you do the right kind of, we do a DEI survey. We've done it globally for clients. It actually comes through our surveys because we're actually asking the right questions. And, you know, you do it and that starts to get you that data at scale. So we hear, you know, in studies that I, as a woman of color with my manager, am experiencing this. And my manager does have a significant impact on whether or not I feel I have an opportunity to grow and advance, right? And if I'm experiencing that from that individual and those around me, boy, am I going to leave? Of course I am, right? And so that to me is, you've got to get it. We hear it in listening sessions. It's not enough, you know, because it's coming through listening sessions. And I think that's where I think data helps. You've got to surface it. You've got to have conversations to talk about it in the situation, not in an unconscious bias training, standalone off to the side where we're having really fantastic conversation. We got to deal with it when it actually happens in the organization, in those interactions every day.
Kristina?
And HR, from my perspective, has to be front and center, right?
Oh,
Like
absolutely.
as a business partner, you have to understand this. You've got to be able to coach leaders. You've got to influence them, and that's leaning into a lot of discomfort. How do I do that? It's a skill that you got to build.
Yeah. One of the things that we do at RTI is, in addition to teaching people to recognize microaggressions, manage for them themselves if they happen to them, we also teach them how to manage if they see somebody else committing one against somebody else. And we talk to them about microaffirmations. So how do we go out of our way to affirm people versus the opposite, where we're not even aware in some cases that we're doing it. I remember we had we put our executive team through a microaggressions training, and one of them said, "Oh my gosh, I did this last night." Oh, right. Like, so some of it is just raising awareness, because the term microaggressions was not in the popular press, 2 years ago. So it's raising that awareness. But the other piece too is, by making it safe to talk about, it allows people to have those conversations. And so we do a lot of work with asking our leaders to talk about it, and in their newsletters, in their emails, in their all hands meetings. So they're having, panels to talk about it. The other piece is, it was one of the questions that we had on our racial equity survey of I can't remember the exact wording, but something like experience a microaggression in the past 12 months. And then you break out the data by demographic, and it's obvious to see that our white people are not suffering from lots of microaggressions, but our Black employees and our other staff of color, they definitely are. And you break it out by male versus female. Our females are experiencing it more than our males, right? We're a microcosm of the world. We're not different in that regard. But just putting that out there, where now people who aren't experiencing microaggressions are noted, wait, what? That's happening here? I didn't know that was happening here. And there's a sort of indignance, like, how did that happen here? That's raising people's awareness.
Yeah, and I think the subtle pieces, like, personally as an example, right? My whole life I've been told, God, she's so articulate. And I'm like, I'm a lawyer. Of course, why wouldn't I be, right? Like, I mean, this is a microaggression or inequity that comes up over and over and over again, right? It's the subtleness of it, and it's connected with a lot of different things. But no one else would be called, oh my God, she's so articulate, right? Like all the time, right? That's a micro inequity and aggression. And it's hard to understand that. So I think that education around that and coaching can actually really help as well. We do a lot of executive coaching around this, because you can shift mindsets and understanding through coaching, because sometimes these things are very difficult. So just wanted to share that example, but it's like, come on now.
Right. And I think it's really incumbent upon leaders to point out when they do something wrong, and they recognize it, and they name it, and they speak it into the room. So at RTI, one of the things we're working on is, hey, you guys, right? That's a micro inequity against people who don't identify as male or who don't identify as binary. So can we eliminate, hey, you guys, or guys, how's it going, guys, from our vocabulary? And we've had leaders who say, I'm trying not to say that anymore. I'm sorry. Let me start again. Good morning, all. Hi, team. Those types of things. And that sort of modeling raises people's awareness as well.
Yeah, exactly. I want to be cognizant of our time. We've got about 6 minutes left. I see about 3 open questions, in the chat and the Q&A that I want to see if we can get to. I think, well, we talked a little bit about the history of law, so I won't do that one now. And the global sense that things that are non-US centric don't have as much political correctness to them in the dialogue. What's your sense of that? Do you think that there's some learnings from the international community that we could better infuse into our US business culture to allow more openness in the discussion around the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging space?
I think that's the public discussion that's happening right now, is do we portray the accurate history of this country in school systems for our children, or do we keep on with business as usual where we don't talk about this, right?
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful that the folks who say, no, let's talk about all of it, win in that fight, if you will.
I think we're probably the only country really actually having really open and candid conversation around this, both externally and internally, in my experience and in my global travels. So I don't think that, I mean, we might be having more of a conversation around race and ethnicity given the history of our country here. But I think that there's opportunity other places in the world. From a maturity perspective, I think the US is much more mature around DEI and organizations, frankly.
Okay. All right.
Particularly when it comes to LGBTQ, if you think about it.
Even women, even
Yes, true.
ethnicity.
Accessibility.
Yeah.
One question that just came in, how would you suggest individuals can most positively call out biased statements, made by people who think, I'm like them, like in quotes?
Oh, can I have this one?
Yes.
So as a biracial woman who presents more white than Black, I get this a lot, right? People make assumptions and they assume that I have perspectives that I do not share. And I find asking questions or repeating what they said. So really, what makes you think that? Or say more about that. Can you tell me more about that? And in the articulation, the stumbling starts very often. Oh, well, I assumed and like, oh, okay, I hear you, but that's not the case. I don't agree with that, or I don't sit with you in that same space. I don't think. But I don't do it as a, well, I'm not this, or did you know that I'm half Black? Because that puts people off. And so I try very hard to make it a question, and the way I just answered it sounds a little snarky. I try when I'm doing it to not be at all, but to be inviting and just explore, because it could be a genuine just lack of understanding and knowledge, or it could have something more untoward underneath it. And I won't know until I ask the questions.
Very
The
true.
only thing that I would add is that we all have the ability to build cultural agility within ourselves, right? No one's born with it. And just because you're born Black or white or a woman or LGBTQ doesn't mean you're culturally agile, right? And so it is based on experience and exposure. We've had more experience and exposure having to deal with people who are different and adapting to dominant groups. And so it might give us a little bit of more opportunity to practice those skills. But I think it's a skill we all have the capacity to build. And we've got to create conversations that are safe and non-judgmental, where people can actually lean into and learn, and with a growth mindset. And I think that's really important versus what I'm hearing today, which is just a lot of division and labels and all of that other stuff that's happening. I don't think it's constructive. So being able to, again, educate how you do that is the opportunity.
Yeah. Very well said. I think, again, not only in respect to, to the audience, but also being respectful of the time. We could go on. There's many questions in the chat and we could spend a lot more time discussing. But Anuradha, Kristina, thank you so much. On behalf of Keystone Partners, I really want to thank both of you, for a very energizing, very pragmatic discussion. I'd also like to thank all of you who took the time to participate, not only in the questions that you've offered, but in just listening and adding ideas and continuing to operate in this space. Thanks to all of you for being here today and participating in the exchange. Really want to wish each of you a great day and look forward to more.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Great to be with you both. Have a great day.
You
Thanks
too.
to you.
Take care.